other mainstream economists might suggest. And that regulatory agenda has to include tenant protections. It has to include rent caps. So Vice President Harris and current President Biden have been talking about rent caps. And as I said, that's a good thing. The thing that they're talking about, though, is simply a directive to Congress. And it's tied to a tax benefit.
We have 15 seconds.
So what we want to see is more assertive, proactive regulatory action from the executive branch and from the Federal Housing Finance Agency.
Tananarive, I want to thank you for being with us. We'll certainly stay on this with KC Tenants and the newly launched Tenant Union Federation. And thank you to Heather Vogel, ProPublica reporter. We're going to link to your 2022 report, Rent Going Up, One Company's Algorithm Could Be Why. And we're going to have you back on to talk about the baby formula shortage and what the U.S. government can do about it. I'm Amy Goodman. Thanks so much for joining us.
The viewpoints expressed in this program are the opinions of the people expressing them and are not necessarily those of Fresh Air Incorporated, its staff, or its board of directors.
Hi, this is Al McFarlane, host of The Conversation with Al McFarlane. You're listening to 90.3 FM, KFAI, Minneapolis. It helps to plug the microphone in. I'm Al McFarlane. This is The Conversation with Al McFarlane. I'm glad to be here. I'm glad to have you along today as well. Thanks to KFAI for partnering with us, bringing The Conversation with Al McFarlane to you every week. And thanks to all of you who join us through other social media platforms. You know, we're streaming live on YouTube at the YouTube channel of Inside News. It's YouTube Inside News MN. Also on the YouTube channel of the Black Press of America, Black Press USA. We're streaming on 2 Facebook platforms, on Twitter and on LinkedIn. And however you connect with us, we appreciate your getting with us, being a part of the program, listening here on KFAI. We have an incentive. We want people to support the show and to show our appreciation. If you would like to win a pair of tickets to a Minnesota Twins baseball game, you simply can become a subscriber at the YouTube Inside News MN platform and just send us a comment saying whatever, who you are, shout yourself out, but open it with the word baseball, and we'll put you in the queue for a possibility of getting a pair of tickets to a Minnesota Twins baseball game here in Minnesota. Beyond that, thank you for subscribing, for listening, and tell everybody you know that we've got a great conversation going on here at The Conversation with Al McFarlane. As always, we want to begin today with our checking in with Coach Leah Jane Denley. Coach Leah, how you doing, my friend? Where are you? And how's it going?
Hey, it is going very, very well. So I am in Houston today and was just finishing celebrating the life of a dear friend and deacon who passed away suddenly, Deacon Floyd Newsome. He's an extremely amazing artist. And so I'll be sending some information over to you soon because I know I'm looking at your background. You are art enthusiast. And so you would be very interested to know about Deacon Floyd Newsome. But I wanted to also take this time to, if I could, thank you so much again for your prayers and your kind thoughts, you as well as the listeners, as well as the folks that subscribe to Insight News. I was able to celebrate the life of my mother, Anna Michelle Spears, and just wanted to, if we could, take a moment to just to celebrate her here. She was my number one fan and supporter when it came to getting out there and not being afraid to show activism, not be afraid to show leadership, not be afraid to give back in a way that would be meaningful, and so yeah, I just wanted to just take that minute and again thank her for her life and know her legacy as well in hand. So Al, I know that you knew my mom and
Absolutely. I was a great fan of hers. She was an amazing leader and servant in our community. So absolutely we'll be missing her, but we also will celebrate her because we know that she stays with us as an ancestor.
Absolutely. Thank you so much. And so moving on, because I know that we've got, I know you have another action-packed and full Tuesday simulcast with our friends at KFAI, but I wanted to just kind of start with what's happening locally, and wanted to talk about our leaders, or I'm sorry, talk about our leaders that are local athletes and celebrities now using their platforms to really push forward the agenda of get out to vote. You know, folks, this is going to be a extremely tight race for the presidency, but more importantly, in my opinion, is all the local races as well, because the I'm going to say it, Madam President and Vice President Walz is not going to have an easy time if we don't definitely make sure that we have the support of our local level leaders as well. And again, they're the ones that are closest to us, right? You know, when we're thinking about our day to day, we want to make sure that people that are representing us at the local level are the people who we definitely need in office. And so this is a silly question, but I'm going to ask it anyway. Were you able to watch the DNC in its totality, or were there things that you knew for sure you wanted to catch? Talk to me a little bit about that, because I want to tell you why I asked that question.
Well, I watched most of it. I think politics are just exciting and fun and necessary. So I'm all plugged in. And if I wasn't watching, it's because there was a reason I wasn't watching. So I stayed tuned, and I went back and watched stuff on YouTube later. So, and several things I watched several times. So I think it's what's going on in the country is big news. And I think this is like once in a lifetime. It's a watershed moment for not only Black people, for this country, but for the world. That's how I see it.
Well, that's exactly what I did too. I didn't get a chance to watch everything as it was happening, but I did go back and watch when the different states were officially nominating Kamala Harris, and I was thrilled. First of all, with the format of having the DJ, I thought that was perfectly just wonderful for the culture. And if everybody noticed, many of the songs were songs from our era of hip hop, and Kamala Harris is unapologetically a lover of hip hop, right? And so when they were announcing Minnesota, and when I was able to see John Randall up there at the DNC on the mic, and anybody that knows or loves the Minnesota Vikings know that John Randall is an NFL Hall of Fame. He's in a Hall of Fame class of 2010. He spent 11 seasons with the Minnesota Vikings, all pro defensive tackle, and overall just a great person. And again, these folks are using their platforms to push for get out to vote. We are involved. You get involved too. I thought that was just phenomenal. What do you think? What do you think, Al?
That's what we need. It's all hands on deck right now. The stakes are so high, and it's a question of us believing that the future actually is in our hands, that we make the difference, and the difference we plan to make is a difference that will benefit not only our people, but benefit our country, and make even those people on the other side will bring them to a point of recognizing that they are better than they have been, and we can help them be what they can be.
Absolutely, absolutely. Well, I've got speaking of football, I've got a dear, dear friend who is an expert and somebody who's going to be writing regularly on our sports page, and that is Kim Davis. Kim, where are you, my friend?
Hey there.
Hey,
Hi, hi. And I want to formally introduce you to our editor-in-chief, Al McFarlane, who has been enjoying your work so far, and I'm sure is going to love hearing what you have to say about our national picture in athletics and sports. So talk to us a little bit about what your thoughts are about what's going on, especially in the NFL right now.
Well, Al, hello there. It's nice to meet you kind of in person, I guess, via this virtual space. Today, the big thing today is the roster cuts, right? The teams around the league are cutting their rosters down to 53. So I've been following that. I took a break, and a guy who's local, but he's also has a national interest is CJ Stroud. And he's been doing a lot of work here locally. In fact, after the hurricane recently, a lot of people had a lot of damage. And I just rushed back from something where he has worked with some partners like Lowe's and rehab the house for an elderly couple, which is really cool. So he was actually there for a few minutes, although they can't always come out in season. So I went to meet him there, but we're just waiting for 3:00 Central Time to see what the final cuts are, because this is the big day, the cuts that are being made. And one of the things Alan, Coach, said that's different this year is all the cuts are being made on one day. In previous years, they would stagger them throughout the season after each preseason game. So everybody's making the cuts on one day. There's over 1,000 guys that are going to be available. So teams are trying to scramble and see who can we pick up, who we put on our practice squad. Do we cut some guys, but we hope that they won't be seen because then we can bring them back. So it's a crazy day in the National Football League. That's what's going on today. And then, of course, we are a week and a half from the start of the regular season.
Awesome. I want to ask Yusef and Jeannie if you want to jump in here, if any sports questions, sports comments. Kim, welcome to the team. Thank you for being here. I'm looking forward to your content regularly. Yusef?
Well, Coach Leah, you mentioned the DNC, and the person who stole the show, in my opinion, was Michelle Obama. Not only absolutely beautiful, but remarkable in terms of her delivery, and the content of her remarks was absolutely excellent. And kudos to Tim Walz, who they call the Happy Warrior, who has really put some energy into the campaign. And I think that the ratings across the country show that. Sports-wise, we're just coming out of the Olympics, and I'm wondering what your major takeaways were from America's team or the other individual athletes who came home with gold.
Well, that's a great question and a great comment. Yeah, she absolutely stole the show, and it was so interesting and wonderful for Barack to say that he's probably the only person that was brave enough to speak after his wife. But
stupid enough.
He said stupid enough, actually.
Yeah, oh, no doubt. But I will say that and we spoke about this a little bit last week, and it's so funny when I wrote it and then I said it, and then when you repeated it out loud, coaches, once a coach, always a coach. I literally put all the pieces together like an hour after we got off air and was like, oh, duh, everybody that I talked about is the coach. Now, here's the interesting that segment, which was brilliant. Look at me being brilliant and not even know it. But what's been really, really cool to see is how, again, everybody is really riding that wave. And Tim Walz is able to just truly be who he is. And everybody is getting mobilized behind the fact that, when people think about a coach, they think about somebody who truly has your best interest and wants you to win. You know what I'm saying? And so that is the thing that I love so much about how just really organic this energizement, if that can be a word. Kim, what are your thoughts?
So I agree. I thought Michelle Obama stole the show, but I thought there were a lot of people who had just amazing, energy. And it was great to see, you talked about athletes, you saw Stephon Curry, make his pitch. You saw Steve Kerr, who has been saying that he was going to be very involved in this election. He's got a personal relation with the issue around gun control. And so we're starting to see it early, but I thought the whole convention was just, it was just a vibe and people were energized. And of course, now it's time to continue the work, but there were a lot of great moments to me.
An interesting fact about Coach Walls, when he took over the football team in Mankato, their record was 0-27. And within 2 years, he had won a state title. So, that's always nice to have on the wall in the den.
No doubt. And I'm going to tell you that absolutely translates into other areas, and which is why I love, my platform of After the Whistle, because, just because you're an athlete, that's not all that we are. You know what I'm saying? And a lot of those skills are translated into other spaces very easily. A lot of times it just takes somebody to help pull that out of you and help identify those skills in you. And one of the reasons why I love that, Kim, that you're part of the team with us. And by the way, I am unapologetically wanting female people in sports, because we want everybody to know that women in male-dominated industries and male-dominated fields, we have a voice too, and our voice is probably the one that's more accurate. I'm just saying, but that's one of your expertises, Kim, is to help to bring out, even with an athlete, how can they present their best self, even off the field.
Yeah, I've covered sports for 30 years. I have to tell people I started when I was 12, and early in my career, there were different places I worked, different stations, different markets where I worked in television, and I always got to know the players and their families and the coaches. And I'd sometimes pull them aside and say, "Hey, you got a second?" Because you don't know what you don't know. And so how you come across on camera is that first impression that you can never get back, or it's the ongoing impression that you probably should try to fix. And so that's really how I even started working with media training, really helping athletes. And then it moved to more corporate stuff, because now it's tougher to work with athletes because you got to go through agents who don't want to spend the money. And it's a whole nother thing, right? But it's really about understanding how to make the media work for you and how to show up so that people receive you the way that you're trying to present yourself. So how do you get to the point? How do you make your message, relatable for people? Not change who you are, not necessarily change your delivery, but just, try to, I say, sharpen it up around the edges. And so I try to help people do that. And so you meet them where they are. And it's interesting. I found that sometimes it's people in the corporate space, people that have a lot of knowledge, that really struggle with this work because they know so much. And first they're like, well, why would I need it? I'm like, it has nothing to do with how smart you are or how articulate you are. But people absolutely decide our value by the way we communicate, right or wrong. How we show up is how it sets the table. So let's set it the way that best suits our message, ourselves, and the people that we're trying to talk to. So it's different ways to come about it. And I enjoy the work, but I think it's necessary because I think everybody needs it. And I'm glad to help people. And I'm happy when I see them get it. I'm happy when I see them get it. So
well, I want you to be a part of our conversation too. We're going to put together a whole mini symposium behind NIL. And I think this directly relates to that. And I'm looking forward to getting that scheduled and something that we can really build out because there's so many different facets to that. And I'm fascinated by that. And Al, I know that you are as well. Mm-hmm. But just to wrap things up today, I just wanted to mention that, of course, on the global side, we have the Winter Olympics that will be in Tokyo. And so, as at the aftermath of this beautiful Summer Olympics that was in Paris, a beautiful, just a presentation all the way around, not just with the athletics, but just overall. I'm interested to see what Tokyo is now going to gonna do. Anybody here have any of you heard of anything that is coming up?
Well, I know you guys are about to wrap. I think it's going to be fascinating. I think the games always are, and I just look forward to see what they come up with.
Well, let's call it a wrap right there. Thank you, Kim. Good to meet you, and thank you for being here, Coach Leah, as always. I'm going to pivot now and move to the next part of the program. I'm Al McFarlane. This is the Conversation with Al McFarlane, and we want to bring another voice in that I think you're going to find fascinating. I certainly am fascinated by the work and the mission of my next guest. Now I've got an echo on. Are you hearing an echo, Cooper? Okay, let me go back then. So my next guest is author Tananarive Due, and she teaches Black horror and Afrofuturism at UCLA. Her most recent novel, Reformatory, won the Los Angeles Times Book Prize for science fiction, fantasy, and speculative fiction. Her stories have been featured on LeVar Burton's Reads and Realm, and she is an executive producer on Shudder's documentary, Horror Noir, A History of Black Horror. Due and her husband and collaborator, Stephen Barnes, wrote for Jordan Peele's The Twilight Zone and for Shudder's anthology film, Horror Noir. They also co-wrote the Black horror graphic novel, The Keeper, illustrated by Marco Finnegan. Due and Barnes co-host a podcast, Life Writing, Write for Your Life. Welcome to the conversation, Tananarive. How are you?
I'm doing great. Thank you very much.
Well, thank you for being here. Meet Yusuf Mjini. Yusuf is a journalist like me and communicator.
Good afternoon. Nice to meet you.
I love that.
So thank you for being here and talk about how what being a horror writer means to you. I've not met anyone that writes in horror. You're the first person, so I'm excited to learn about what's in your mind and how it comes up and what you've produced.
Well, absolutely. And listening to the moving tribute to a lost mother actually brings me to why I write horror. My late mother, Patricia Stevens Due, she co-wrote the book pictured behind me on my wall, Freedom in the Family, a mother-daughter memoir of the fight for civil rights. And I think, any of your audience members who know, activists have a toll for their work. And it shows up in stress, it shows up in trauma. She wore dark glasses, basically 80% of the time, even indoors, after she was tear gassed during a nonviolent demonstration at Florida A&M University back when she was 20 years old in 1960. And that was lasting scars. So when I see young people being tear gassed today, that is like a re-traumatization, because I know that those scars are lasting, even if they're not physical scars. And I think my mother sought refuge from real life horror, which was white supremacy, which was Jim Crow, which was state violence against her, in watching fictitious horror about monsters. I remember growing up, she always had these creature features playing the Wolfman, Dracula, those universal monsters that ultimately, like Frankenstein's monster is very sympathetic and misunderstood. So I don't know if she was relating to the monster. I don't know in terms of the way Black people were treated by society. I don't know if she was related to the townspeople chasing the monsters with their torches, because that reminded her of what it feels like to be afraid, but there's something in fictitious horror that I personally also find very healing. And it was only through executive producing Horror Noir, A History of Black Horror for Shudder, which, by the way, is named for the wonderful book Horror Noir. I think it's the subtitle is, I have it right in front of me, A History of Black American Horror from the 1890s to the present. We've been in Hollywood since the beginning.
Okay.
And that book covers it. That was an adaptation of the book. And I was very happy to be invited to participate. But it was only through working on Horror Noir that I realized that a lot of Black people, Black women, got their love of horror from their mothers and their aunties and their grandfathers. And even though we were either not represented at all or represented very poorly, like you wouldn't even want to claim it, it still fits the wound, I think. I think marginalized communities with sort of this memory, this genetic memory of running and hiding and being chased and being captured. That's a genetic memory we carry. And it may have happened during slavery, or it may have happened last week, down the block, but we carry that memory. And I think seeing people in movies and reading about people in books who are also having to face some kind of monstrosity and stand up to it, that's the piece. It's the standing up to it that speaks to me. And I imagine also spoke to my mother. But every book I write is an effort to help me feel more courageous as I face life's more mundane terrors compared to, oh, guess what? There's a demon in the house. Oh, guess what? You've just been sentenced to a reformatory with ghosts.
Mm-hmm. Let me read some more about you. In my notes, the notes suggest that and say that you have been and are a leading voice in Black speculative fiction for more than 20 years. You've won the American Book Award, an NAACP Image Award, a British Fantasy Award, and your writing has been included in Best of the Year anthologies. Your books include, we mentioned earlier, The Reformatory, which was a winner of the Los Angeles Times Book Prize, Chautauqua Prize, Bram Stoker Award, Shirley Jackson Award, and New York Times Notable Book. Also, The Wishing Pool, which I have right here, and other stories, Ghost Summer Stories, and My Soul to Keep, The Good House. She's also, as she just mentioned with her late mother, civil rights activist Patricia Stevens-Dew, co-author of Freedom in the Family, a mother-daughter memoir of the fight for civil rights. So what a great background. You know, you were mentioning this DNA of the chase, of being chased, and as you were saying that, what popped in my mind was my wife's own story, Tananarive, about being in Crystal Springs, Mississippi, small town south of Jackson, and as a teenager or preteen, having to walk and being her and a group of friends being chased by a group of white boys in a car. And what they knew instinctively was that this could be the end of your life, or it could be your life changed. And so they ran, and she ran and into like even a big drain pipe under a bridge. But she met somebody, I talked to somebody a few days ago from home, and they reminisced about that particular life-altering event of being chased. And that's kind of what you're talking about, is how that sense of escaping or running, something that we all connect with. And that kind of is the basis for what you're writing in horror. Is that correct?
It's just real, it's just real. So in my latest novel, for example, The Reformatory, it's loosely inspired by actual family history. Like that story you just told me, I can think of other ways I would spin that into a horror novel or a horror short story. For The Reformatory, after my mother passed away in 2012, by early 2013, my family heard from the Florida State Attorney's Office because they thought that she had an uncle who might have been buried on the grounds of the Dozier School for Boys in Marianna, Florida. And they were reaching out to family members to get permission to exhume bodies. And, I didn't even know about Robert Stevens. I don't think my mother knew that she had an uncle who died there. I don't think her father ever told her she had lost a brother, which I think speaks to the trauma that a family suffers when a young person is basically ripped out of the nest. And this continues today, I don't have to say. In fact, I would say juvenile incarceration is much higher today than it was in 1950 because of the prison industrial complex as it is now. But in 1950, it was also segregated. In 1950, that story you just told, Al, about your wife, had she been murdered or assaulted in any way by that mob of young men, it might have been unheard of for her to get any kind of justice in the so-called criminal justice system. So that's the scenario of the children I write about in the Reformatory. He's only 12 years old. It's the equivalent of a schoolyard kick. The other boy started it. The white boy, who's the son of a rich planter in town, pushed him first. He's 16, much bigger, yet it's Robert in responding and also trying to protect his sister, because this boy was making advances toward his sister. And as a 12-year-old, he was very confused about what he was seeing. He ends up sentenced for 6 months at a fictionalized version of the Dozier School for Boys, which was a horrific institution in real life that was open between, I think, 1900 and 2011. They finally shut that place down. And it was fraught with accusations of abuse from the very beginning. It's not like it was doing great, and then in 2011, they decided to shut it down. I mean, there had been efforts to shut this place down for years, and it was basically a for-profit prison. They would lease the children out to work on nearby farms. If boys ran away, local farmers would get $50 if they chased them down and caught them. So when you talk about chasing, yes, literally, there is running, there is hiding in this novel, but and there are ghosts. And it's a little weird for me to say this, but the only way for me to write this was as a horror novel, because I briefly considered nonfiction based on the fact that I formerly also was a reporter. I was a reporter for the Miami Herald for about 10 years back in the day. And I'd also co-authored this memoir with my mother. So there was a version of this story that could have just been, who was Robert Stevens? What happened to him? But honestly, for two reasons. I was like, first of all, there were already a lot of other memoirs out from survivors of the Dozier School. And it felt like, especially since I had never known that Robert Stevens existed, that did not feel like the right route. And also, terrible ending, not a good story. To fictionalize him, I can help memorialize his name so that people know he lived, that he was not buried and lost to time, like so many of those young people who in real life were buried in unmarked graves at this facility. Like, you would get a letter saying, by the way, your child is dead. You were not even invited to the burial. This is how this place operated. This was the lack of respect and humanity that this institution practiced toward its young people there and the families, because everyone is in prison when a child is in prison. Well, when anyone is in prison, but especially a child, a child. So telling it as a horror novel and adding ghosts really was the only way to lighten the story. You hear what I'm saying? It makes it a lighter story to add ghosts. And the true monsters are the humans, the warden, and the people who are in this bureaucracy of a children's prison that literally was too big to fail. And this small town in real life of Marianna, Florida, but in my novel, I call it Gracetown, Florida, which is a town I've written about in other works where magical things happen, especially related to children.
Talk about magic. Maybe if you would walk us through the different genres in this Afrofuturism, magical realism. There's 4 or 5 different phrases I've seen in reference to the category of work that you're doing.
That's true. It's hard to categorize sometimes. You know, the umbrella term I use is Afrofuturism. And the way I teach there are different definitions. Some people call it the Black speculative arts movement, because the actual term Afrofuturism from the mid-90s was coined by a cultural observer and scholar named Mark Derry, who was not himself Black. So he was sort of observing a phenomenon that was underway, and the word he gave it was Afrofuturism. And since that time, you know, some people have tried to clarify it in different terminologies, but if we call it Afrofuturism, I teach it as the science fiction, fantasy, and horror. The way I teach it is of the African diaspora, although I will note that African fantasy and science fiction is also its own thing called African futurism. So those two things should not be forgotten, but it's a very broad category. So it's comics, it's magical realism, which as the title implies, and it has its roots in Latin America, but it's a world where it's mostly our world with hints of magic that people take for granted for the most part. So it's not a startling thing if a chair pulls out at the table, because that is your absent ancestor who has joined you, and it's not a cause for fright. So I think that's one of the biggest differences in magical realism. Horror is where the uncanny happens and the prevailing emotion is fright. So in my stories, if a chair pulled out of the table, as in real life, if a chair pulled out of my table, I would be scared. And in fantasy is imaginary places and imaginary creatures. That's like the Lord of the Rings, dragons, that kind of thing is also fantasy. Magical stories, there are magical stories. There are also considered fantasy about wizards and people with powers. You know, these are just some broad characterizations. People who read these genres probably want to chime in and say, wait a minute, what about this? But generally speaking, I call it the art of the not real, the art of the imaginary. So Black Panther, there is unfortunately no real life Wakanda, but we can dream about Wakanda would be like. And again, with the Reformatory, using that fantasy, because I'm using ghosts, using that element in the story softens. It has two functions. Number one, it honors the fact that so many children have died in the past. You don't have an infestation of ghosts unless a whole lot of people have been killed at this site. It's a cursed site, really, in the world of this novel. But also, believe it or not, there's some levity with the ghosts, and having ghosts doesn't mean then that it's necessary for me to focus on death after death after death of children, because no one wants to read that. That's a very difficult read. I wouldn't want to read that. I had a hard enough time putting my poor protagonists, what I put them through, but it was always with the intention, and I won't spoil the novel, but for people who are a little wary, your poor heart, I get it. I had a son who was Robert's age while I was working on the story, and he's 20 now, so that tells you how long it took me to write it. But I wrote it with the ending in mind, and I wanted it to be a better ending for Robert Stevens than what he suffered in real life.
Yusuf, any questions, comments, thoughts, reflections?
Well, let me throw you a ringer. Would you consider Richard Wright's novels and short stories and the work of Jelani Cobb, such as The Devil and Dave Chappelle, Afrofuturism?
Wow, that's a good question. I mean, is it horrific? I mean, when you talk about Richard Wright, you could characterize Richard Wright as a horror writer in my book, but typically horror has a supernatural element. And that would be like, so you can get the same emotions reading Richard Wright that you would reading a horror novel, but typically in a horror novel, it's not as closely rooted to reality as a supernatural element. So people would argue back at you. The Devil and Dave Chappelle, Afrofuturism, in terms of cultural criticism, probably yes. In terms of the topics and the subject matter, yeah, I could see it. That's why I say it's a very broad category. Like George Clinton and Funkadelic is Afrofuturism for a couple of reasons. A, because of when you look back on, say, the mothership, which is now in the Smithsonian, right? The mothership landing on the stage, while it's, come down sweet chariot, come and take me home, is a riff of the old Negro spirituals and enslaved people speaking in code to each other about how to escape, being flipped to a futuristic imagery of a spaceship taking you away, like Sun Ra.
Waiting for the good ship Jesus.
Yes,
to come and carry me home.
Or some kind of utopia. Sun Ra had space as the place, even Octavia Butler, the late great, was very preoccupied with the freedom of space. I think in the Black imagination, space is a place of freedom and liberation. But I think as we crawl toward the point where we are going to see space colonization, the reality is setting in that because it's billionaires who are going to go to space, anybody else who comes along for the ride is just going to be there for work and labor, and probably very expendable labor at that. So I honestly have to say, I do not share the same fascination with space. I think if you ever hear a story about me on any kind of a spacecraft, it is not true, or that is someone pretending to be me. I am not interested in space. But science fiction in Afrofuturism especially helps us open up our imaginations to either a better world. And a lot of Octavia Butler's fiction, it's a worse world, like Parable of the Sower, that we are lurching toward if we do not fix it. If we do not create a reset, we are very much on track to enter the Parable of the Sower dystopian world of hyperviolence in the streets, lack of services for communities, basically everyone on their own, pay for policing, which we practically have to do now, depending on what neighborhood you live in. So yeah, it can be a cautionary tale. It can be a vision of utopia. But I think one thing that is in common in all Afrofuturism, be it music, literature, comics, is images of empowered Black protagonists who are leading, right? Like Miles Davis is leading in the fusion between electronica and jazz with Bitches Brew, for example, is also considered Afrofuturism. It's creating something new out of what was old. And one of the primary tenets of Afrofuturism is that you have to simultaneously hold space for the past, present, and future. There's no writing about the future without acknowledging the past. As I said with that George Clinton example from the mothership, I mean, it's a callback to ancient songs in creating a vision of futuristic space travel. It's like in the original Black Panther, when you see they have a telepathically powered hovercraft, that is like technology and magic, but at the same time, the herdsmen are carrying spears because there is that homage to tradition. And no, it's not an insult. And no, there's nothing wrong with it. Thor has a hammer. I don't see the problem. It is holding space for our entire experience as we map a path to the future.
I love sci-fi movies and all the Star Trek stuff. I'm kind of a Trekkie, but my question had always been, where are we? And when do we take the opportunity to project our version of the future? And I think that space travel is going to be inevitable and eventually accessible to everybody at some point in time, not just the billionaires, though they may have the first dibs on the experience. But so the question is, where do we show up and how do we show up? And I think for me, Afrofuturism means detailing, describing, authoring futures in which we win. Futures that, because our position, the roles we are assigned in other people's stories aren't roles that have us coming out ahead. We're incidental at best, and we get wiped out usually. So how do we avoid understanding that that's the way the world is going to be, because it's the product of their imagination? How do we replace that with our imagination, which shows us both as vital and resilient and regenerative and expansive, and ultimately as what's the right word for it, sovereign, and our sense of what it means to be part of existence, to be at the foundation of existence itself. How do we tell stories that portray us as the very beginning, or even before the beginning, as we describe futures that are different from what we've been given by the European system so far? What do you think?
Well, there's good news and bad news on that front. The good news is, since the 1990s, when that term Afrofuturism was first coined, especially I would say in the past 10 or 15 years, in literature, Afrofuturism has taken off. I mean, there was a time back in 1998 when I first met my husband, Stephen Barnes, when Clark Atlanta University had the first, really that I know of, Afrofuturism conference, even though they did not call it that. It was Octavia Butler, her mentor Samuel R. Delaney, Stephen Barnes, Jewel Gomez, who was a pioneer in queer Afrofuturism with her Gilda stories about vampires, and me, little me. I had just published my first book, but there were only a handful of us on that stage. When I was teaching at Spelman College 10 years ago, and I had an Octavia Butler celebration 2 years in a row, I could fill the stage each year. In fact, I could have filled the entire auditorium and beyond with all of the writers between adult fiction. YA Afrofuturism is very big right now. Lamar Giles has a great novel called Ruin Road, which is called YA, but to me, it speaks to the great benefits of using a fantasy premise. Like, what if you made a wish that no one would be afraid of you because as a big Black teenager, like a boy who plays football at a mostly white school, you're getting so much unwanted attention when you go to shops or when you're walking down the street. If you make a wish that no one is afraid of you, what are the unintended consequences of that wish? And it's pretty deep. And it's like, oh, he shouldn't have done that. So it's actually interrogating a true life problem. And I have a 20-year-old Black son. So this is a problem I know well, of that natural societal fear of Blackness that has existed since we were abducted and brought to these shores. Fear of payback, which I am convinced is what drives our gun culture. And the continuing misrepresentation of what Blackness is, right? In literature, we're getting it handled. There are young writers today. I mean, N.K. Jemisin, Nnedi Okorafor, I just mentioned Lamar Giles. I could really go on and on. Rivers Solomon, so many, Nalo Hopkinson, so many authors who are publishing within Afrofuturism to do exactly what you're talking about. But the bad news is that disconnect between literature and Hollywood. And it's ironic because most of Hollywood, or at least half of Hollywood, is supposed to be adaptations. So you would think we would have seen a whole bunch of Octavia Butler adaptations by now. She's only had one, Kindred, on Hulu. There was the other Black girl that was adapted. This was not by Octavia, but it's also Afrofuturism that was on Hulu. But it's been very slow. And the reason it's very slow to translate between literature and Hollywood is, well, simply, frankly, bias, white supremacy. I mean, there's no other way to put a word on it. People will characterize it as executives like to work with their friends, and executives like to buy projects where they see themselves. That translates to white supremacy because those executives are overwhelmingly white, and the people they have worked with previously are overwhelmingly white. And it is a very tight-knit club. It is notoriously difficult to break in, no matter what your experience level, talent level, or race or gender. It's hard for everyone to break into Hollywood. But as a former editor of mine used to say, if the rest of people trying to get into Hollywood get a cold, we get pneumonia. It's way more difficult for us. And we saw some really exciting changes, unfortunately, in the aftermath of the murder of George Floyd, as all over the country, every industry was racing to show how sympathetic they were to Black Lives Matter, which I remember when they were calling it a terrorist group, but what a difference the day made. There were all these efforts. A lot of projects were bought. A lot of people were hired to help make decisions. And then, wow, guess what? By 2024, with the contraction of Hollywood, guess who's the first to go? Guess which shows are the first to get canceled or not even greenlit at all? That sort of fever and discovery of Blackness kind of dissipated. And we had seen a bump before that with Jordan Peele and Get Out. There was a little bump before that. So in horror, I saw the impact of that immediately. I mean, literally, people would bring up his work in meetings, and it was a new vocabulary for understanding how horror could be used with social messages that are very effective with marginalized people, Indigenous people, queer people. You use that kind of funhouse mirror. It's not the thing itself. Don't depict the lynching and expect me to be entertained. That's just called trauma porn. But if you can do something artful that is based in fantasy, not something that actually happened to my grandmother or my great-grandmother, but fantasy that punches that same button that makes me as fearful as a lynching, that helps me both process pain and feel entertained and a little bit of emotional remove from it. So it's a slow process. And I don't mean to say this just selfishly. Obviously, I have many, many, many books. I would love to see more adaptations. So far, my husband and I have only co-written a couple of short adaptations as a part of a larger work called Horror Noir, which was mini movies, not the documentary, but there was also 6 stories, and 2 of them were ours. That was my first adaptation, a 30-minute version of a short story I wrote called The Lake. And we did one called Fugue State, but we're still waiting, for the Reformatory. Stephen King apparently just mentioned the Reformatory on PBS as one of the books he recommends out of, I think, 8 books. And I was so excited about that. And it's won, as you mentioned, a lot of prizes. So ordinarily you would think that would have been snapped up as a film. But we had it in TV development for a couple of years, even before it came out, couldn't quite get the traction, still haven't quite gotten the traction, but I remain hopeful. It's just difficult. It's just because all these projects cost multi-millions of dollars. And when you're asking other people to finance your work, they want to finance work that centers them.
That's right. That's right. Well, it's fascinating that, the answer ultimately has to be in alternative methods of generating revenue to support our projects. And the question is, how do we innovate, and how do we become more self-reliant and not depend on the model? I was in my office one time keyboarding on maybe some stories, and Asian guy and a white guy kind of walked by. So my newspaper was in a strip mall in St. Paul. And so this guy who owned another newspaper and a friend of his walked by and watched me, and I had this kind of aha conversation. I didn't know them before. They knew what I was doing. They introduced themselves. I kept working and listening, talked to them. Finally, we talked about the technology that I was actually working on typesetting with the desktop machines that I had at that time. They were advanced. And the conclusion of the conversation was that this is a Chinese guy talking to an African guy, me, a black guy, and another guy. After all, the world belongs to no one. And the premise before that was that the order that we are presented with every day presumes that power belongs in a certain place, that it's always been there, and it will always be there, that it's intractable and immovable. But in our conversation, strangers, but both entrepreneurs and both business people, both communicators, we jump straight to the idea that, that is simply an illusion, that the world belongs to no one, and that all of us have a capacity to organize and reassemble things differently. So I'm saying, is that what we have to do for projects that you're working on? And it's easy for me to say it because I'm not in Hollywood and you're dealing with the reality of it every day. But what do you imagine will break the log jam and have you and other creators available and accessible to revenue streams to bring your product online? How's it work? How's it going to work?
This is a mouthful. We could probably do a whole show speculating on how to get around it. I mean, there are answers that have to do with working inside the system and pressure. And like there was a campaign called Oscars So White that April Rain was behind on social media that has had a lot of impact on getting more people, Black people and people of color as Oscar voters. But the way Hollywood is right now, the contraction where even experienced people can't get work, it's almost better to look at it as if there is no such thing as Hollywood. There is you and your story. Yeah. And how do you get your story out there? One of the things that I like to encourage new screenwriters or even established screenwriters to do is I feel like we walk around with our hand out. Please, sir, will you give me a pence, sir? It's like, and that's what it feels like to go out pitching is you're like begging for these pennies. To them, it's pennies. And really, one of the most empowering things I did while I was at Spelman College and living in Atlanta when my own mother was ill is my husband and I co-produced a short film adapting our own story, Danger Word. It was the first short story we ever wrote together. It was the first short film we made together. My friend Lucina Fisher directed it. She has since gone on to win an Emmy for something on Netflix called The Dads, by the way, which is such a wonderful program. And she's so talented. But that, even though, we optioned it briefly, it never took off, but it exists it's I would invite people to check it out on YouTube for free, dangerwordfilm.com, as an example of what you can do with vision and creativity. We got a veteran actor, Frankie Faison, to be in our little movie because he had never played a grandfather caring for his grandchild, and he wanted to do the role. He had never been in a monster movie. He wanted to do that. So I would say that the answer is really creativity and how to get around the gatekeepers, creativity in terms of how to find the funding. We have to look outside of the United States very often for tax credits or people who are looking for content. There are all kinds of things out there, but if you can't do that, what you can do is write a script with maybe 1 or 2 sets where you don't need that many actors and shoot it yourself. And it's easier said than done, but a lot of writers have within their circle people who know how to direct, who know how to edit a film. And I know this because my students at UCLA do it every quarter. I have students every quarter, some of whom have never made a film, who turn in short films for credit at the end of the quarter. So it can be done. Find that circle of people. Read the books. You don't have to go to even film school. There are tons of books on how to shoot films. You can watch other people. How do they run their crowdfunding campaign? We raised our money through crowdfunding, but there are also grants. There are contests. I just say, don't be frustrated. Make your movie. Even if it's only 15 minutes long, it might get into a film festival. It can live forever on YouTube. It can end up on Amazon if that's where you choose to have it. You would really be surprised. And I think a lot of people are missing this trick because it's not only giving yourself valuable experience on set, which even experienced TV writers were not getting in recent years. That was one of the hangups and why the Writers Guild went on strike, was the system was so log jammed, as you said, that people were repeating room after room after room and never being promoted because they weren't learning the skills they needed to be showrunners. They weren't allowed on the set. I wasn't able to go on set when my little horror noir movies were shot because of COVID at that time. So I lost another opportunity to get on set experience, which is what you need to rise up and bring other people with you. You can't bring other people with you if you're still scrounging and begging for pennies at the bottom. You can bring other people with you as you rise in the system and mentor people and bring interns on your set who can learn from the ground up while you learn from the ground up. I really cannot more strongly encourage screenwriters, actors, whoever you are. If you're trying to get into this industry, right now, there's no better time than to get in from the outside, because getting in from the inside is much more difficult now than it has been in recent years.
Yusuf, you as a radio producer used to do marvelous things with music. And I'm wondering your appreciation of Black music, of jazz, if my memory serves me correctly, had a futuristic orientation that was based on the legacy of the Black story, the Black experience, the African way of knowing and of being, of spirituality. And I'm wondering, Tananarive and Yusuf, how you see what we have created in music showing up in what you're doing in writing horror, Afrofuturism. What do you think? How does music affect you? What do you listen to when you're doing your items? And Yusuf, think back about your show, how you used to really lift the community with the music you did. But Tananarive, you go first, please.
I'm inspired very much by music. It helps me get into flow state. I like to create a playlist when I'm working on a new novel. So the Reformatory was set in 1950. I was listening to music from that era just to take me there, to take me back. Same with, I love a lot of horror soundtracks and scores, and also jazz. Love Miles Davis. So yeah, Yusuf, I'd be curious to know what your thoughts are too.
And we got less than a minute, Yusuf.
Similar. We did a lot of radio shows. The Boy Who Painted Christ Black, a lot of Richard Wright short stories, and we would use period music between scenes as a bridge, jazz in particular, jazz and blues. But it's a fascinating opportunity, yeah, for radio, for television, and for film.
Listen,
and thank you to Michelle Delicious and King Demetrius for joining us and commenting.
Thank you too. Listen, we're out of time. Tananarive, so nice to meet you. Look forward
Thank
to
you.
learning more about you and your work. Yusef, thank you. I'm Al McFarlane. We'll see you next time.